The radio crackled with static before the voice cut through like a blade. "Overlord, this is Neptune 6. We have a problem." Staff Sergeant Marcus Torres pressed his headset tighter against his ear, the desert wind whipping sand across the makeshift command post. The SEAL team leader's voice carried that particular edge reserved for situations where everything had gone catastrophically wrong. "Go ahead, Neptune 6, Torres replied, his fingers already reaching for the tactical frequency dial. Around him, the forward operating base hummed with the nervous energy of soldiers who could smell trouble brewing on the horizon. "The airfield at Coast is gone, completely gone. Taliban hit it with everything they had: rockets, mortars, the works. Runways cratered to hell, towers down, and we've got approximately 40 wounded who need immediate evacuation." The transmission paused, filled only with the distant sound of gunfire. "Problem is, we're surrounded. They're using the wounded as bait, waiting for us to call in air support so they can shoot down whatever shows up." Torres felt his stomach drop. Coast Forward Operating Base had been their primary extraction point for 3 separate SEAL teams operating in the Paksha province. Without that runway, those teams were stranded in some of the most hostile territory in Afghanistan, with winter approaching and Taliban forces closing in like wolves. "What's your current position, Neptune 6? "Grid reference. Hold on." More gunfire echoed through the radio. "Grid 774321. We're dug in about 2 clicks north of what used to be the airfield. Got good cover, but we can't move. Too many wounded, too many hostiles between us and any viable LZ." Torres studied the tactical map spread across the folding table before him. The nearest suitable landing zone was over 50 kilometers away, too far to transport critically wounded soldiers under fire. The helicopter pilots were already shaking their heads before he even looked their direction. Blackhawks couldn't operate in this kind of contested airspace without massive air support, and even then, the risk was enormous. "Sir," came a voice from behind him. Torres turned to see Captain Rodriguez, the base air operations officer, holding a phone with a troubled expression. "I've got Davis Air Base on the line. They're saying they might have an asset that could help, but—" he hesitated, glancing around at the assembled officers. "They want to send Banshee." The name hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Even in a forward operating base where rumors spread faster than wildfire, everyone had heard whispers about Banshee. The pilot who flew missions that didn't officially exist, who could land aircraft in places where physics suggested it was impossible. Some said she was reckless. Others said she was gifted. Most said she was probably both. Captain Elena Banshee Vasquez had earned her call sign not for the sound her aircraft made, but for the way she seemed to appear out of nowhere when death was closest. She flew the A-10 Thunderbolt II, a plane designed for close air support that could absorb tremendous damage and still keep flying, but using a fixed-wing aircraft to extract wounded soldiers from a compromised position with no functioning runway. That bordered on suicide. Torres keyed his radio again. "Neptune 6, how much time do you have?" "Honestly, maybe 6 hours before they overrun our position. The wounded, some of them won't last that long without proper medical attention." The SEAL's voice carried the weight of command, the knowledge that every decision could mean the difference between his men living or dying. "We need a miracle, Overlord." Torres looked at the tactical display showing the positions of friendly and hostile forces, the destroyed airfield, and the impossible geography that lay between salvation and catastrophe. In the distance, he could hear the distinctive sound of an A-10's twin engines spinning up on the runway. Banshee was already preparing for launch. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Elena Vasquez completed her pre-flight inspection of the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Her ground crew watched with a mixture of admiration and concern as she methodically checked every system, every control surface, every piece of equipment that would keep her alive in the next few hours. The Warthog, as pilots called it, was built like a flying tank, ugly, slow, and nearly indestructible. But what she was planning to attempt, had never been tried before in combat conditions. "Banshee, you sure about this?" Senior Airman Jackson called out as he topped off the aircraft's fuel tanks. He'd been working with Alina for 2 years, had seen her pull off maneuvers that defied explanation, but this mission pushed beyond the boundaries of rational risk assessment. Alina paused in her inspection of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed the aircraft's spine. The massive 30mm gun could fire depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, turning enemy armor into twisted metal and smoke. But today, the cannon was secondary to her primary mission, getting wounded soldiers out of an impossible situation. "Jackson, remember that time in Helmand when Command said the LZ was too hot for extraction?" she asked, her voice carrying that peculiar calm that came over her before dangerous missions. "Remember what happened when we ignored them?" Jackson smiled despite his concerns. That day, Alina had landed her A-10 on a highway under fire, loaded up 6 wounded Marines, and taken off while Taliban fighters shot at her from 3 different directions. She'd brought everyone home, though her aircraft had taken so much damage that maintenance had declared it a total loss. 2 days later, she was flying combat missions in a replacement aircraft. "Yeah, but ma'am, that was a highway. This is." He gestured helplessly at the tactical briefing sheets clipped to his tablet. "This is dirt, rough dirt, in a valley surrounded by mountains, with hostiles in every direction." Alina finished her walk-around inspection and climbed up onto the aircraft's wing. The A-10's cockpit sat high above the ground, protected by a titanium bathtub designed to keep pilots alive even when everything around them was exploding. As she strapped herself into the ejection seat, she could feel the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders. "Banshee, tower control," came the voice through her headset. "Weather update shows deteriorating conditions over the target area. Visibility dropping, winds increasing. Recommend delaying mission until morning." Alina adjusted her flight helmet and began the engine start sequence. The twin turbofan engines wound up with their characteristic whine, different from the aggressive roar of fighter jets but equally purposeful. "Tower, Banshee. Weather's the least of my problems today. Request clearance for immediate departure." "Copy, Banshee. You're cleared for takeoff and good hunting." As her aircraft rolled down the runway, Alina thought about the radio transmission she'd intercepted from the trapped SEAL team. 40 wounded soldiers, surrounded by enemy forces, with no viable extraction route. The kind of situation where conventional wisdom suggested waiting for better conditions, calling in massive airstrikes, or accepting casualties as the price of war. But Alina had never been particularly interested in conventional wisdom. The A-10 lifted off into the late afternoon sky, its distinctive silhouette unmistakable against the backdrop of mountains and desert. In the distance, storm clouds were beginning to gather, a weather front that would make flying difficult and landing nearly impossible. Alina banked toward the target coordinates, knowing that somewhere ahead, 40 American soldiers were counting on her to accomplish the impossible. The mountains of eastern Afghanistan stretched endlessly below Alina's aircraft as she flew toward the coordinates provided by the trapped SEAL team. At 12,000 feet, the A-10 was above most small arms fire, but well within range of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles that Taliban fighters had been using with increasing frequency. Alina kept her aircraft moving in unpredictable patterns, never flying straight and level for more than 30 seconds at a time. "Neptune 6, this is Banshee inbound to your position. Request sitrep and marking of your location," she transmitted on the tactical frequency. "Banshee, Neptune 6. Good to hear your voice. We're in a defensive perimeter about 2 clicks north of the destroyed airfield. I can mark our position with colored smoke on your approach, but be advised, we're taking sporadic fire from multiple directions. Enemy appears to have RPGs and at least one heavy machine gun position on the ridgeline to our east." Alina consulted her moving map display and compared it with the handwritten notes she'd made during her mission briefing. The valley where the SEALs were trapped was narrow, surrounded by rocky hills that would make a conventional landing approach nearly impossible. Even worse, the prevailing winds were coming from the east, which meant she'd have to fly directly over the enemy positions to line up with any potential landing area. Neptune 6, I need you to identify the best possible landing zone in your area. Something relatively flat, at least 800 meters long, with minimal obstacles. I know it's not ideal terrain, but I need your best assessment. There was a long pause before the SEAL team leader responded. Banshee, I've got to level with you. There's no good LZ down here. The terrain is rough, rocky, with a lot of loose sand and scattered boulders. The longest clear area we can see is maybe 600 meters, and that's being generous. It's also directly exposed to enemy fire from elevated positions. Alina had expected as much. She'd studied satellite imagery of the region during her flight planning, and the geography was unforgiving. Sharp ridgelines, deep wadis carved by seasonal floods, and rocky terrain that would challenge even the most skilled pilot under ideal conditions. But the A-10 had been designed for exactly these kinds of situations, landing on rough airstrips, operating in contested airspace, and surviving damage that would destroy other aircraft. Copy that, Neptune 6. I'm going to overfly your position to get a visual assessment. Keep your people under cover. I expect we'll draw some attention. Alina pushed her aircraft into a shallow dive, descending toward the valley floor while maintaining enough speed to avoid becoming an easy target for ground fire. At 3,000 feet, she could clearly see the destroyed airfield, a blackened scar on the landscape where the main runway had been torn apart by explosions. Smoke was still rising from several buildings, and she could make out the twisted remains of a control tower that had been reduced to rubble. 2 kilometers north of the airfield, she spotted the SEAL team's position, a cluster of rocky outcroppings that provided natural cover from most directions. She could see muzzle flashes from Taliban positions on the surrounding ridgelines, and the distinctive smoke trail of an RPG that missed her aircraft by less than 50 meters. Neptune 6, I have visual on your position. Stand by for landing assessment. Alina pulled her aircraft into a tight orbit around the valley, studying the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had landed in impossible places before. The proposed landing zone was worse than she'd hoped, a stretch of hard-packed earth intersected by several drainage channels and dotted with rocks that could destroy landing gear or tear apart an aircraft's belly. But it was flat enough, and more importantly, it was the only option available. Neptune 6, Banshee. I can make this work, but I'll need precise coordination. How quickly can you move your wounded to the landing zone once I'm on the ground? We've got stretcher teams ready to go. Figure 3 minutes to get everyone loaded if we move fast. The SEAL's voice carried the urgency of someone who understood that every second on the ground would increase the risk exponentially. But Banshee, you need to know, the moment you touch down, every Taliban fighter in this valley is going to converge on that position. We can provide covering fire, but it's going to get very intense very quickly. Alina checked her fuel status and weapons systems. She had enough 30 ammunition to suppress enemy positions during her approach and takeoff, but once she was on the ground, she'd be completely vulnerable. The A-10's armor could protect her from small arms fire, but a well-placed RPG or mortar round could end the mission catastrophically. Understood, Neptune 6. I'm beginning my approach now. Mark your position with colored smoke and have your people ready to move. This is going to happen fast. As Alina lined up for her final approach, she could see red smoke beginning to rise from the SEAL team's position. In the distance, muzzle flashes sparkled from enemy positions like deadly stars, and she knew that in the next few minutes, she would either save 40 lives or become another casualty statistic in America's longest war. The approach to the improvised landing zone required Alina to fly lower and slower than she'd ever flown in combat. The A-10's stall speed was already uncomfortably high for this kind of terrain, but she needed to bleed off as much velocity as possible to have any chance of stopping before running out of usable ground. At 200 feet above the valley floor, she could see individual Taliban fighters moving between rock formations, some of them shouldering RPGs, while others set up machine gun positions. Neptune 6, beginning final approach. Recommend you engage all visible enemy positions now, Alina transmitted as she lined up with the stretch of desert hardpan that would serve as her runway. Copy Banshee, engaging targets to your east and south. You're cleared for landing, make it count. The sound of concentrated gunfire erupted from the SEAL team's position as designated marksmen began engaging enemy fighters with precision rifle fire. Alina could see tracer rounds arcing across the valley, some aimed at her aircraft, others directed at the Taliban positions that posed the greatest threat to the landing zone. A rocket-propelled grenade detonated 50 meters to her left, close enough that the shockwave rocked her aircraft, but not close enough to cause damage. Alina pushed the A-10's throttles forward and triggered a burst from the GAU-8 cannon, walking a line of 30 rounds across a ridgeline where she'd spotted multiple muzzle flashes. The depleted uranium projectiles turned rock and human flesh into dust and vapor, temporarily suppressing the enemy fire from that direction. But there were too many enemy positions to neutralize them all, and more Taliban fighters were appearing every minute as word of the American aircraft spread through their communications network. At 100 feet, Alina could see the landing zone in detail, a roughly rectangular patch of ground marked by scattered boulders and intersected by two shallow drainage channels that would test her aircraft's landing gear to its limits. The surface looked harder than she'd hoped, baked by months of desert sun into something resembling concrete, but there were patches of loose sand that could catch her wheels and send the aircraft tumbling. Landing gear down, she announced to herself, more habit than necessity since she was the only person in the aircraft. The A-10's tricycle landing gear extended with mechanical precision, 3 points of contact that would have to absorb the impact of a landing that was part controlled crash, part miracle of aerodynamics. At 50 feet, Alina could see wounded soldiers being carried toward the landing zone on improvised stretchers. Some were conscious, others clearly weren't, but all of them represented lives that hung in the balance of the next 60 seconds. She could also see Taliban fighters advancing through the rocks, getting closer to the SEAL team's defensive perimeter with each passing moment. Alina flared the aircraft at the last possible second, bleeding off airspeed while maintaining just enough lift to prevent a catastrophic impact. The main landing gear touched down first, bouncing once on the hard-packed earth before settling into a controlled roll. The nose gear came down next, and Alina immediately applied maximum braking while deploying the aircraft's speed brakes to create as much drag as possible. The A-10 rolled across the improvised runway, its wheels kicking up clouds of dust and sand that provided temporary concealment from enemy fire. Alina could feel the aircraft shuddering as it hit the drainage channels, the landing gear absorbing impacts that would have destroyed a less robust aircraft. At 400 meters, she was still moving too fast. At 600 meters, she began to worry that she wouldn't stop in time. At 700 meters, with rocks and a steep embankment looming ahead, the A-10 finally came to a halt. Neptune 6 Banshee is on the ground. Bring me your wounded now. Before Alina had even shut down her engines, she could see SEAL team members sprinting toward her aircraft carrying wounded soldiers. The side of the valley erupted with gunfire as Taliban fighters realized that the American aircraft was stationary and vulnerable, but the SEALs returned fire with disciplined accuracy, keeping the enemy at a distance while the evacuation proceeded. Alina kept her engines running, ready to take off at a moment's notice, while wounded soldiers were loaded into every available space in her aircraft. The A-10 hadn't been designed as a medical evacuation platform, but desperation had a way of making the impossible seem routine. The evacuation proceeded with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers who had trained for exactly this kind of scenario, even though none of them had ever imagined it would involve a fixed-wing aircraft landing in the middle of a firefight. Alina watched through her cockpit mirrors as stretcher teams carried wounded soldiers to her aircraft, where corpsmen and SEAL medics worked to secure them for what would be the most dangerous takeoff of her career. Banshee, we've got 32 wounded loaded, plus 8 walking wounded who can sit in available spaces, the SEAL team leader reported through her radio. His call sign was Neptune 6, but Alina had learned during the mission briefing that his name was Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, a 15-year veteran who had led more combat operations than most officers saw in entire careers. The remaining wounded they didn't make it. Alina felt the familiar weight of combat operations, the knowledge that success was measured not in lives saved, but in lives that didn't have to be lost. 8 soldiers had died in the Taliban attack on the airfield, casualties of a war that seemed to produce an endless supply of tragic mathematics. But 40 soldiers who might have died were now crowded into her aircraft, and that was the mission she could control. Copy Neptune 6. What's your team's status for extraction? Negative, Banshee. My team stays. We've got overwatch positions established, and we can't abandon this valley to Taliban control. You take the wounded and get them to proper medical care. We'll find another way out. Alina understood the decision but didn't like it. Morrison and his team were choosing to remain in an increasingly dangerous position to ensure that she could take off safely with the wounded. It was the kind of calculated sacrifice that defined special operations, accepting greater personal risk to accomplish the mission and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Understood, Neptune 6. Give me a headcount on souls aboard. 40 wounded, plus 1 corpsman who volunteered to stay with them during transport. That's 41 total. The SEAL's voice was calm, professional, focused on the details that would keep everyone alive. Be advised, some of the wounded are critical. They need to get to a trauma center within the next 2 hours or we're going to lose them. Alina checked her fuel status and calculated flight time to the nearest military hospital. Bagram Airfield had the facilities to handle critical trauma cases, but it was 90 minutes away even at maximum speed. She would have to push her aircraft to its limits while carrying a load far beyond its normal capacity, all while flying through airspace that remained contested by enemy forces. Neptune 6, I need to know about weight and balance. Where did you position the wounded in my aircraft? We distributed them as evenly as possible, heaviest casualties in the center section, walking wounded toward the rear. Your corpsman, Hospital Corpsman 2nd Class Williams, he's got medical training and experience with combat casualties. He'll monitor everyone during the flight and handle any emergencies. Alina made final adjustments to her flight controls, compensating for the unusual loading configuration and the additional weight that pushed her aircraft close to its maximum takeoff limits. The A-10 had been designed with generous margins of safety, but she was about to test those margins under the most challenging conditions possible. All right, Neptune 6. I'm beginning takeoff roll in 30 seconds. Keep those enemy positions suppressed and thanks for the hospitality. Alina heard Morrison's voice one last time before she focused entirely on the task of getting airborne. Banshee, it's been an honor. Bring our boys home safe. She pushed the throttles forward, feeling the twin turbofan engine spool up to maximum power. The A-10 began rolling down the improvised runway, gathering speed slowly because of the additional weight and rough surface conditions. Through her side windows, she could see muzzle flashes and tracer rounds as the SEAL team engaged Taliban positions, creating a corridor of suppressive fire that would give her the best possible chance of getting airborne before enemy fighters could bring effective fire to bear. At 60 knots, Alina could feel the aircraft becoming responsive to her flight controls. At 80 knots, she began to feel lift developing under the wings. At 100 knots, with rocks and rising terrain ahead, She pulled back on the stick and felt the A-10 reluctantly leave the ground, carrying 41 souls toward safety through a sky filled with deadly possibilities. The climb out of the valley tested every skill Alina had developed in 12 years of military flying. The A-10 was heavily loaded and climbing slowly, making it an easier target for the surface-to-air missiles that Taliban fighters had been stockpiling throughout the region. She kept the aircraft low, following the terrain contours while gradually gaining altitude, using the mountains themselves as cover from enemy radar and visual acquisition. Bagram Control, this is Banshee with 41 souls on board, including critical casualties requiring immediate medical attention. Request priority handling and direct routing to your location. Banshee Bagram Control, we have medical teams standing by. You're cleared direct, maintain current altitude until clear of hostile territory. Be advised, we're tracking multiple surface-to-air missile systems in your area of operations. Alina acknowledged the transmission while keeping her attention focused on the instrument panel and the terrain ahead. The wounded soldiers behind her were counting on her flying skills, but they were also counting on the medical expertise of Hospital Corpsman Williams, who was working to keep the most critical casualties stable during the flight to definitive medical care. 20 minutes into the flight, Alina heard Williams' voice through the internal communication system. "Pilot, I've got 2 casualties who are deteriorating rapidly. Is there any way to increase our speed?" Alina checked her engine parameters and airspeed indicator. She was already flying faster than the A-10's normal cruise speed, but the aircraft could handle more stress if necessary. "Hold on, Corpsman. I'm going to give you everything this plane has." She pushed the throttles to military power and put the aircraft into a shallow dive, trading altitude for airspeed while maintaining enough clearance to avoid ground-based threats. The A-10's engines roared with increased power, and Alina could feel the airframe vibrating slightly as it approached the edge of its normal operating envelope. 30 minutes out from Bagram, Alina established radio contact with the medical teams that would be waiting for her arrival. "Bagram Medical, Banshee inbound with 41 casualties. I need your trauma teams ready for immediate patient transfer. Some of these soldiers won't survive delays." "Copy, Banshee. We have multiple trauma teams standing by, plus helicopter assets to transport the most critical cases to Germany if necessary. What's your ETA?" Alina calculated time and distance based on her current ground speed and the GPS waypoints programmed into her navigation system. "Bagram Medical, estimate arrival in 45 minutes. Be advised, I'll need assistance with patient offloading. My aircraft wasn't designed for medical evacuation." As the A-10 flew through the afternoon sky toward Bagram Airfield, Alina reflected on the mission that had brought her to this point. 3 years earlier, she had been a newly qualified A-10 pilot, eager to prove herself in combat operations, but struggling to gain the respect of more experienced aviators who questioned whether women belonged in close air support missions. Her call sign Banshee had initially been intended as mockery, a reference to the Irish folklore creature whose wailing foretold death. But Alina had embraced the call sign and made it her own. If she was going to be associated with death, she decided, it would be the death of America's enemies and the prevention of death among America's soldiers. Over 3 years and more than 200 combat missions, she had earned a reputation for accomplishing the impossible and bringing everyone home alive. Today's mission would either cement that reputation or end it catastrophically. As Bagram Airfield appeared on the horizon, Alina began her approach to what she hoped would be the successful conclusion of the most challenging flight of her career. The approach to Bagram Airfield should have been routine after the impromptu landing she just executed in hostile territory. But Alina found herself more nervous than she'd been during the entire combat portion of the mission. The weight of 41 lives pressed down on her shoulders as heavily as the overloaded aircraft pressed against the limits of its design specifications. Every control input had to be precise. Every decision calculated to ensure that soldiers who had survived Taliban attacks and a desperate evacuation wouldn't be lost to a preventable accident. Bagram Tower, Banshee on final approach with medical emergency. Request crash and rescue standing by. Banshee, cleared to land runway 21. Emergency vehicles are positioned and ready. Medical teams are standing by for immediate patient transfer. Alina could see the emergency response vehicles lined up along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, and medical personnel who specialized in combat trauma care. The sight reminded her that this mission wasn't finished until the last wounded soldier was receiving proper medical attention in a fully equipped trauma center. The A-10 touched down smoothly on Bagram's main runway, a surface that felt like silk compared to the improvised landing zone she'd used 2 hours earlier. As she taxied toward the medical evacuation area, Alina could see dozens of medical personnel preparing for the largest single casualty event the base had handled in months. Banshee, this is Hospital Corpsman Williams. I need you to know we saved them all. Every soldier who was alive when we left that valley is still alive now. You did good, pilot. Alina felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her as she brought the aircraft to a stop. The mission had succeeded, but the cost had been enormous. 8 soldiers had died in the initial Taliban attack. Lieutenant Commander Morrison and his team remained trapped in hostile territory, and the strategic situation in Paksha province had deteriorated significantly. But 40 soldiers were alive who might otherwise have died, and in the mathematics of warfare, that constituted victory. As medical teams swarmed around her aircraft, Alina began the process of shutting down her systems and completing the post-flight inspection that would determine whether the A-10 could continue flying combat missions. The landing gear showed signs of stress from the rough terrain, and there were several bullet holes in non-critical areas. But the aircraft's legendary durability had once again proven itself under the most challenging conditions. "Ma'am, Colonel Henderson would like to see you for debriefing as soon as you're finished here," a young airman informed her as she climbed down from the cockpit. Alina nodded, knowing that the mission debriefing would be followed by an extensive investigation into the circumstances that had led to such a risky operation. Military aviation was built on careful risk assessment and standardized procedures, and what she had just accomplished fell well outside normal operational parameters. But as she watched wounded soldiers being carefully transferred from her aircraft to waiting ambulances, Alina felt a deep sense of satisfaction that transcended concerns about regulations or career implications. She had become a military pilot to serve her country and protect American soldiers, and today she had fulfilled that mission in the most direct way possible. 3 hours later, Alina sat in the base commander's office, surrounded by senior officers who were trying to understand how a routine combat air patrol had evolved into an unauthorized medical evacuation mission that violated numerous safety protocols while simultaneously saving 40 lives. "Captain Vasquez, I want to be clear that your actions today were both heroic and completely outside established procedures," Colonel Henderson began. "You took risks that could have resulted in the loss of both aircraft and aircrew, and you made decisions that should have been coordinated through proper command channels." Alina maintained her composure, knowing that military discipline required accountability even when missions succeeded. "Yes, sir. I understand the concerns, and I accept responsibility for my decisions. However," the colonel continued, "the results speak for themselves. 40 soldiers are alive today because of your actions, and intelligence reports suggest that Lieutenant Commander Morrison's team successfully extracted from their position 6 hours after you departed. The strategic situation remains challenging, but we didn't lose anyone else." Alina felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but she remained focused on the broader implications of the day's events. The Taliban attack on Coast Airfield represented a significant escalation in enemy capabilities, and American forces throughout the region would need to adapt their tactics accordingly. Sir, I'd like to request permission to return to combat operations as soon as my aircraft is cleared for flight. The situation in Paksha province is still developing, and I believe close air support assets will be needed. Colonel Henderson smiled for the first time during the debriefing. Captain, your aircraft won't be ready for at least 48 hours, and you're grounded for mandatory crew rest after today's mission. But yes, you'll be returning to combat operations. In fact, we're recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for today's actions. As Alina left the colonel's office, she thought about the radio call sign that had once been intended as an insult, but had become a source of pride. Banshee represented her commitment to appearing wherever American soldiers faced death, and to ensuring that as many as possible returned home alive. Today's mission had reinforced that commitment, and demonstrated that sometimes the most important victories came from refusing to accept that certain situations were impossible. The sun was setting over Bagram Airfield when Alina finally returned to her quarters, exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that the A-10 Thunderbolt II remained one of the most effective close air support platforms ever designed. But tonight, 40 American soldiers were sleeping in hospital beds instead of coffins, and that made every risk worth taking. The investigation into the coast airfield evacuation took 3 weeks to complete, during which Alina remained grounded pending the findings of a formal military review board. The investigation examined every aspect of her decision-making process, from the initial radio communications with the trapped SEAL team to the unprecedented landing on unimproved terrain under hostile fire. Military aviation safety officers interviewed dozens of witnesses, analyzed flight data recordings, and consulted with experts on A-10 operational capabilities. Alina spent her days attending interviews, writing detailed reports, and watching other pilots fly the combat missions she felt she should be flying. The Taliban had increased their activities throughout eastern Afghanistan following their successful attack on coast, and American forces were stretched thin trying to maintain security in multiple provinces simultaneously. Captain Vasquez, the review board has completed its analysis, Colonel Henderson announced when Alina reported to his office on a cold morning in late November. I'm going to read you the official findings, and then we'll discuss your future assignments. Alina sat at attention, prepared for whatever consequences her actions might have generated. She had violated numerous regulations and safety protocols, but she had also saved 40 lives under circumstances where conventional procedures would have resulted in significant casualties. The review board finds that Captain Alina Vasquez demonstrated exceptional piloting skills and sound tactical judgment under extreme combat conditions. While her actions deviated from established procedures, they were consistent with her primary mission responsibilities and resulted in the successful evacuation of wounded personnel who would otherwise have faced probable death or capture. Alina felt relief beginning to replace the anxiety that had dominated her thoughts for 3 weeks, but she remained focused on the colonel's words. Furthermore, the board notes that Captain Vasquez's actions provide valuable lessons for future combat operations in similar terrain and tactical situations. Her techniques for landing A-10 aircraft on unimproved surfaces will be incorporated into advanced training programs for close air support pilots. Colonel Henderson set down the official report and looked directly at Alina. Captain, you're not being court-martialed. You're being promoted. Effective immediately, you're being advanced to the rank of major, and you're being transferred to Davis Air Base to serve as an instructor pilot for advanced A-10 tactics. The promotion was unexpected, but Alina felt conflicted about the assignment transfer. Davis Air Base was located in Nevada, far from the combat operations where she felt she could make the most significant contribution to American military efforts. "Sir, I appreciate the promotion and the confidence it represents, but I'd prefer to remain in combat operations. There's still work to be done here, and I believe my experience could be valuable in ongoing missions." Colonel Henderson smiled knowingly. "Major, you'll be training the next generation of A-10 pilots who will be flying these missions. Your combat experience, particularly your innovations in unconventional landing techniques, will help prepare them for situations that can't be simulated in standard training programs." Alina began to understand the broader significance of her new assignment. The military had recognized that warfare was evolving in ways that required new thinking about aircraft capabilities and pilot training. Her successful evacuation from coast demonstrated that traditional limitations on fixed-wing aircraft operations might not be as absolute as previously believed. "Additionally," the colonel continued, "you'll be working with aircraft designers and engineers to develop modifications that will enhance the A-10's capability for operations in austere environments. Your practical experience will inform technical improvements that could save lives in future conflicts." Alina accepted the assignment, recognizing that her influence on military aviation might ultimately be greater through training and development than through individual combat missions. But she also requested permission to return to combat operations periodically, maintaining her proficiency and staying current with tactical developments. 6 months later, Major Alina Banshee Vasquez stood in front of a classroom filled with newly qualified A-10 pilots, preparing to teach them lessons that couldn't be found in any manual or technical publication. The students ranged from recent flight school graduates to experienced pilots transitioning from other aircraft, but all of them shared the same goal: mastering the art of close air support in the world's most unforgiving combat environments. "Today we're going to discuss landing techniques for unimproved surfaces," Alina began, clicking to a PowerPoint slide that showed aerial photographs of the improvised landing zone, where she had evacuated the wounded soldiers from coast. "The first thing you need to understand is that the A-10's design margins are more generous than most pilots realize, but only if you respect the aircraft's limitations and plan accordingly." As she began her lecture, Alina reflected on the journey that had brought her from being mocked as Banshee to being respected as one of the military's foremost experts in unconventional A-10 operations. The call sign that had once represented skepticism about her abilities now symbolized innovation, dedication, and the willingness to attempt the impossible when American lives hung in the balance. The students listened intently as she described the technical details of landing on rough terrain, but Alina knew that the most important lessons couldn't be taught through PowerPoint presentations. They had to be learned through experience, practiced through repetition, and proven through the kind of high-stakes situations where theory met reality. After class, one of the students approached her with a question that Alina had been expecting. "Ma'am, do you think we